think it goes without saying that the 2024 season was a massive wet fart disappointment for the Chicago Bears. There's no other way to put a positive spin on that. Surprising, they're going to this offseason. They hire a new head coach in Ben Johnson, a defensive coordinator in Dennis Allen, and what that means is it's time to get players that fit the new systems that you're looking to implement that align with the coaching staff's vision. You have lots of cap space. It's time to go fix this fucking roster. So it's not surprising that the Bears have already been pretty active in this offseason. They released DeMarcus Walker and Gerald Everett, gave themselves a little bit more cap space, and they aggressively went after addressing the trenches. The pick that they got, I think, from the Justin Fields trade, they flipped that into Jonah Jackson. They traded a 2026 fourth-round pick to get All-Pro Joe Thuney from the Kansas City Chiefs. They went out early in free agency and signed Drew Dahlman to be their starting center, which was kind of the move I think a lot of people were pointing to, one of those must-do kind of things. They signed Grady Jarrett and Dayo Odenigbo on the defensive side of the ball. So they aggressively pursued the trenches, which was an absolute must. Like, these were the weaknesses of this Bears team in 2024. They had to go after it. And in particular, they had to go after it because as you look ahead to the draft, you have to put yourself into a position in this year, in this time, in this draft for the Bears, where you're not trying to draft for need. You're trying to draft for best player available. And one could argue effectively that with what Ryan Poles and this Bears front office has done to date in this offseason, in free agency, has put themselves in a position where they've got options and they've got flexibility when it comes to next month's NFL draft, which then begs the question of what should they do? And the reality is, when you look at pick 10, there's only a couple absolute no-goes, realistically. Quarterback. I think it makes sense. You just took Caleb Williams number 1 overall. There's no reason to change course at this point. Wide receiver, you've got a big investment in DJ Moore. Rome Odunze was your 9th overall pick last year. While I feel a speed wide receiver is in need, you're taking one in the top 10 leads to a diminishing return in value, either for the wide receiver that you take or Rome or DJ or so, combination of a couple of them. Not wise roster build strategy. That's more of a day 2 focus, day 2 kind of priority. And then you would say, with the trade for Jonah Jackson and the subsequent short-term extension they gave him, and then the trade for Joe Thuney, it's very likely that guard is out of the mix at pick number 10. Likely. You could potentially justify it. I certainly could make an argument, but I'm also trying to be realistic here and say quarterback, wide receiver, interior offensive line, left guard, center, right guard, those are out of play for pick 10. But transparently, every other starting position on the offensive, defensive side of the ball is in play and should be in play. And that's how this needs to be. To the Bears fans that are saying trenches, 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 and only stubbornly focusing on trenches, look, I get it. You are trying to sit there and take a bazooka to the Bears' biggest problem this past season. I get it. I respect it. It's in theory the right approach. However, at some point in time, you can only have but so many studs and so many starters on the offensive and defensive lines. You have to build up the other parts of the roster too. That doesn't mean that you totally forsake the trenches. It's just this whole notion of, well, you got to go in the draft and you just continue to draft offensive and defensive linemen no matter what. No, that's not what the fuck you do here. The whole point of being that active in free agency, even though I agreed with some of the moves and liked them and other ones I didn't so much, the reality is the Bears have put themselves into a position where they can have flexibility and they can do any number of different things, and that's exactly what the approach should be. Everything else should be in play because the Bears lack elite players, period. Their need for top-end talent supersedes any positional needs, just flat out. You know, you can also make an argument. It would be wise to try and pick up future picks, although I would say in this draft class, that's kind of boo-boo. I don't know how willing teams are going to be to move up. You could say, well, they might be afraid that somebody's going to take a guy that's high on their board and they'll feel more pressure to move up. That could happen. The other thing is teams will look at it and be like, It doesn't really matter. Like, most of these guys are being overdrafted anyways relative to their talent. We'll just sit here and take who we think is the best of the bunch. We'll see how it plays out next month, but either of those could happen. But when you look at the Bears at pick 10, option one, you're going to see a lot of people talking about Ashton Jeanty, the running back from Boise State. And there's going to be plenty of debate on this one and continue to be plenty of debate on this one over the next several weeks until we get to draft night. I'll just focus for the moment on why this could make sense or would make sense. He certainly would represent a big upgrade over DeAndre Swift and Roschon Johnson. Ben Johnson's offense is predicated on having an elite running game. And it would still be helping Caleb Williams while potentially getting an elite guy, which again, I want to emphasize, the Bears need game breakers, difference makers, game changers. They don't have those types of guys on this roster. They don't. The best player they have on their roster relative to the position is Joe Thuney, who they just traded for, and he's 32 years old, and he's a guard. You get what I'm saying? Like, they have a significant lack of top-end, high-level talent. And Ashton Jeanty would certainly do that. Although here's the thing. Who says he's even there at pick 10? I wouldn't put it past the Raiders at 6 with Pete Carroll as the head coach to be strongly interested in him. I wouldn't put it past the New Orleans Saints at pick 9 to be interested in him. I wouldn't put it past the Dallas Cowboys at pick 12 to want to peel up ahead of maybe the Bears to go get him. All these Bears fans that are either stubbornly advocating and pounding the table for Jeanty or advocating against it, in a month it might be a moot fucking point, honestly. And in this draft, it's certainly possible that he's not even there at pick 10. But if he is, you do have to consider him. You absolutely have to. And if Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles feel he's the best player on the board at that point, then you have to take him. I don't want to hear about your fucking running backs, don't draft them early type of dumb dick philosophy. I don't want to hear about this. I don't want to hear about that. The Bears need game breakers. They need difference makers, game changers. If they think Jeanty is one and they think he's the best player on the board at 10 and he happens to be there, then you fucking take him. End of story. But there are other options too, right? Offensive line. Do you really want to stop addressing the offensive line now? Yes, you've addressed the interior, which badly needed to be addressed, but all this shit about Braxton Jones. Braxton Jones is not very good. Darnell Wright is. Braxton Jones is below average. No matter how much PFF tries to tell you otherwise, trust your eyes. Well, he's good. I think more Bears fans relate that to his former draft position, which was him being a 5th round pick back in 2022. Fucking he's in year 4 now. That draft pick status doesn't matter anymore. It's about who he is. And do you really want to go a year away from potentially looking at paying a below average to at best average left tackle over $20 million a year? And that's what you would be staring down the barrel of here with Braxton Jones. That seems insane to me. Why would you want to do that? Meanwhile, if you're the Bears and you've got a left tackle like a Josh Simmons or Armand Membu, and you value them and you think that they can be top 5 level type of left tackles at the NFL, then you take them. You take them for the now and you take them for the future, and the fact that they will give you a higher level of performance in terms of what you're projecting them to do compared to Braxton Jones, and do it for a fraction of the price for the next several years. Left tackle should absolutely be in play here. I can't imagine people sitting there and saying, well, they address the interior of the offensive line and then want to avoid the one other obvious spot. The Bears need 4 new starters on this offensive line. They've gotten 3. They need a 4th. The fuck you mean? And then obviously defensive line. Yeah, it's still a big need when you think about disruptive pass rushers both on the edge and up the middle. You can never have too many of those guys. I think the bigger question for me a little bit here is, does the talent and value align with the draft slot? I'm not so sure, right? Now, obviously, if there's a Mason Graham that falls to you at 10, you run up there and you draft him. If an Abdul Carter gets to 10 or even gets close to 10, you might have to explore going up to get him. Then you run up and you take those guys and you figure the rest of the shit out later, right? Again, that's what this draft should be about. It's about flexibility. It's about options. It's about taking top-tier talent and figuring shit out. Defensive line absolutely should be in consideration as a possibility at 10. I just don't know that it makes sense at 10 based off of the talent that's available. that might be one of those, if you trade it back a few slots, it starts to become more tenable and more understandable. Tyler Warren, you're going to hear some talk about him, and tight end. You're going to have some Bears fans say, well, what about Cole Kmet? And others like me are going to say, what the fuck about him? Maybe Ben Johnson sees Cole Kmet and sees a guy that does some things okay, but he's not the Sam Laporta type of tight end that he would want. And he feels like Tyler Warren would bring more to this team in the passing game. Again, feels like it would be a little bit better if you were peeling back. But, it's the whole thing of like, you could talk about trading back, but you got to have a dance partner there, right? But let's just entertain for a second. The Bears were able to find a dance partner and move back maybe 3 to 6 or 7 slots in round 1 and pick somewhere between maybe 13 to 17. We've talked about the running backs. Then you start to wonder, does Omarion Hampton come into the equation? Offensive line would definitely be in the equation there, as would defensive line, but I don't think it ends there, right? If you trade down a little bit in round 1, you're looking at safeties. Maybe a Manwari or Starks. And you're going to say, well, it's a devalued position. If you think one of those guys can be elite at their position, like not just Pro Bowl level, like legit Pro Bowl level, but potentially all pro level, then you take those guys in the middle of round 1 and you feel really fucking good about it. Because again, folks, the Bears need difference makers. They need game breakers, game changers. They don't have them. Linebacker. Jihad Campbell, Jalen Walker, if you think one of those guys is going to be a special player, you don't have a special linebacker on this fucking roster, then you take him. If you think Will Johnson as a corner, he's there, and you're like, man, you think him and Jalen Johnson and Kyler Gordon could be the premier trio of corners in the league, and you'll be able to cover people like crazy, which buys your pass rush more time to get home, then you fucking do that. Did you get what I'm getting at here? There are all types of options, and we shouldn't be so narrowed in. It must be this player, it must be that player, it must be this position or the other. There are lots of different ways that you could go. And the same thing holds true with day 2, and I would argue especially with day 2. Anything but quarterback at that point. Speed wide receiver absolutely should be in the mix there. More depth in the trenches on the offensive and defensive lines? Abso-fucking-lutely. Linebackers, maybe Schwarzenegger from UCLA in round 2. Absolutely. Secondary, yes. Safety, corner. You really going to trust Tyreek Stevenson as a starter in 2025? Are you really? Are you really? Perhaps running back, especially if you don't take Genty or Hampton in round 1. Again, it's about options. So for those that are saying, don't take the running back, let's be clear here. This is a booty cheeks draft. And if the strength of this draft, or one of them, is this running back group, then at some point in time, you have to dip into that pool. And if that comes in round 1, so fucking be it. It would not be my ideal choice. But again, you're not going into this draft focused on fucking needs. You need guys that can make a difference right away and be elite players. That's why I'm talking about Josh Simmons or Membu at left tackle. That's why if you trade back a little bit, it opens up other positions. You could see a situation where a lot of Bears fans that are so focused on this, it has to be trenches, trenches, and only trenches, are going to be whining and disappointed in a month or so when they look at this Bears draft, and they might see it doesn't look anything like they would expect, but that might absolutely be the right course of action. For the first time in a long time, the Bears draft philosophy in 2025 does need to be much more focused around best player available versus best player at a key position of need. That's a good spot to be in. You still got to execute. You still got to pick the right players, mind you. But all I'm encouraging Bears fans right now is keep an open mind. They have options. And they've got to do their best to explore them all.